The pipeline troops, while exceedingly impressive in peacetime, were seen as far too young and untested to make significant contributions to easing wartime logistical burdens. Those who held this perception would be thoroughly refuted following the 1979 decision, Directive Number 312-12-001, to, as they described, deploy certain contingents of Soviet troops stationed in the southern regions of our country to the territory of the DRA in order to assist the friendly Afghan people.
Мы уходим, прощайте, горы, вам видней. В чем наша боль и наша слава, чем ты, великая держава, искупишь слезы матерей. Нам вернуться сюда больше не суждено. Сколько нас полегло в этом долгом походе, и дела недоделаны полностью, но мы уходим, прощайте, горы, вам видней. Какую цену здесь платили, врага какого не добили, каких оставили друзей.
As the Soviet army marched into a war their organization, doctrine, and equipment had seldom prepared them for, the pipeline troops forcibly carved their name into the history of the Afghan mountains. Through field pipelines spanning much of the country, 5.4 million tons of fuel were delivered to the 40th Army, roughly 80% of all fuel consumed in the course of the conflict. Commander of the 40th Army, Lieutenant General B.V. Gromov, noted that the pipeline troops were one of the most important branches to sustaining combat operations in the region, as reliably delivering fuel by road in such rugged terrain with the palpable ambush risk proved nigh impossible. Within this video, I hope to provide an answer to why those serving within the logistical arm of the limited contingent often remarked, "The infantry and tankers do not envy the drivers, and the drivers do not envy the pipeliners."
А мы нашли себе дело на целую ночь, а город полон огней, а мы обжечься не прочь. Зачем ты закрыла вуалью лицо? Мне тебя и так не узнать. Все изменилось опять. Сегодня наш праздник сгорает свечой. Играй, музыкант, играй мне еще. Я больше тебя не прошу ни о чем. Кончается праздник, играй мне еще.
On December 25th, 1979, the 40th Army crossed into Afghanistan from Termez and Kushka. By January of the following year, 3 divisions, 1 brigade, 2 separate regiments, and aviation subunits had entered the country. The scale and frequency of combat operations, as well as patrols on the ground and in the air, created an exceedingly high demand for fuel. Additional petroleum products would also be required to fulfill agreements made with the DRA, where fuel would be provided to both their military and civilian sector on behalf of the USSR. The majority of the Soviet population did not seriously consider this to be a declaration of war. It was believed that this would be an expedient endeavor. Immediate coverage of the event was misleading, showing the planting of trees in Kabul alongside bountiful humanitarian assistance. No combat operations were mentioned at this time. Following the introduction of the 40th Army into Afghanistan, weapons from the US, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and China began to flow into the country to support the opposition forces. With no defined structure or fixed size for tactical units, which could range from 20 to 50 men, and an abundance of heavy machine guns, mortars, mines, and anti-tank weapons, these units rarely engaged Soviet troops directly. As a result, ambushes alongside the shelling of outposts and supply points became their primary mode of limiting the 40th Army's operations. These ambushes sought to destroy or seize commercial and military convoys alike. Mountain passes and other hard-to-reach areas were ideal for such attacks. Due to the severely limited infrastructure of the region, there were no railroads to ferry large quantities of equipment and material. To make matters worse, the road network of Afghanistan was underdeveloped, with the exception of the Termez-Kabul highway. On top of these concerns, rivers, lakes, wells, and springs within Afghanistan were often contaminated with bacteria. Soviet soldiers, who were inexperienced when it came to sustaining themselves in these conditions, were not made aware of the fact that traditional methods for purifying water for drinking purposes are ineffective at high altitudes. As a result, gastrointestinal illness spread throughout the troops. It was in this environment that the pipeline troops were tasked with providing a solution. One that was not only sufficient to support the amount of fuel required by the 40th Army, but capable of evolving with those stationed in Afghanistan, as they adjusted their organization to better suit the terrain. In the first few months of the war, troops stationed in Afghanistan were reliant on Army and district-level motorized transport to deliver fuel. This was problematic, as after the delivery was completed, these units had to then drive back and repeat the process, making for long and inconsistent timetables. The existence of intense traffic, along what was only a two-way highway, further delayed the supply of this resource. A pontoon bridge was erected near Termez to open up another route for material support across the Amu Darya, but northern access to the bridge was inconvenient, with many turns and steep inclines. Tractors were often required to tow vehicles that could not navigate these conditions. In early 1980, it was already becoming clear that the only way to ensure the uninterrupted delivery of fuel to the southern bank was a field pipeline. The deputy chief of the Central Directorate of the Pipeline Troops was tasked by Nikitin to accompany a larger element of the rear services to inspect the crossing and provide suggestions on how fuel supply could be improved. The decision to establish a temporary transshipment zone on the Amu Darya was approved by the Chief of the Rear Services of the Armed Forces of the USSR, following a report drafted by this collective. This would require a fuel depot to be established in Termez, and a second depot in Haraton, which would be connected by the pipeline troops. On January 4th, Nikitin would summon the Chief of Staff of the 95th Pipeline Brigade, alongside the unit's deputy commander for armaments, to brief them on the upcoming assignment. Here he emphasized that detailed reconnaissance of the route would be required. Logistics officers within the Turkestan military district were skeptical, as the pipeline troops at this time were still seen as an immature branch of the Soviet armed forces. They believed that with some alterations, flatbed trucks could adequately service the 40th Army. Nikitin objected to this insinuation, and ordered the pipeline to be deployed. At this time, he had risen through the ranks, and was now head of the Central Directorate for Rocket Fuel and Fuel Supply of the Ministry of Defense, and so overruling this decision was impossible, much to his detractors' chagrin. Half of a PMT-150 field pipeline set was allocated to the ad hoc unit, created to accomplish this task. They would deploy 3 lines, and cross the river with support from tractors, communications, and a tugboat provided by accompanying formations. The Amu Darya proved to be a rather difficult river to cross, considering the speed of its current, which could reach 4.5 meters per second. Its depth and the volatility of the crossing points, which could rise and fall by a factor of 640 meters, further complicated the process. To make matters worse, the riverbed, which was unstable due to being formed almost entirely out of sand, would frequently shift. As initial attempts proved unsatisfactory, unique methods had to be employed. It was hypothesized that if the pipeline was laid next to an unfinished bridge, the impact of the current on the pipeline could be somewhat reduced. To accomplish this, a tugboat delivered a cable to the southern bank, which was then used to pull pipeline segments across the river. The end of these lines would rest on the riverbed, 300 meters from the bank, after which a ZIF-55 compressor would fill them with air, allowing them to rise to the surface. To ensure that the line did not break or deviate, tractors on each of its sides moved gradually in opposite directions to straighten the PMT-150. The air was then vented from the line as it rose from the riverbed, and was finally pulled ashore. By the end of January, the pipeline was completed and began to deliver fuel into Afghanistan. Throughout the Afghan war, this pipeline would be replaced, totaling 38 PMT-150s and later PMT-P-150s. To assist the District Fuel Service in deploying the aforementioned depots, Nikitin assigned officers who had previously served at depots within the GSFG and USSR. Their experience was invaluable, and was personally praised by Kropotkin. The Amudarya transshipment zone included 20 R-50 railway fuel tanks, with a capacity of 1,000 cubic meters, a field fuel depot with a capacity of 4,600 cubic meters, later improved to a regional fuel depot with 10,000 cubic meters of total capacity, constructed from 16 MR-250 tanks and 4 MR-150 tanks, and a secondary fuel depot with a capacity of 6,000 meters. Construction of the transshipment zone was officially completed on February 13, 1980. Unfortunately, as expected, the Amudarya was fickle, and often buried the pipeline, or washed sections away entirely. The river also worked to erode the pipeline, which was caused by sand constantly smashing into the side of the PMT-150s, which would eventually cave. As soon as the transshipment zone was established, it was necessary to install a new pipeline to connect the two depots. The PMT-P-150 was employed in the replacement operation, as its Rastrub connections were believed to be more reliable and stable. The commander of the 95th Pipeline Brigade was tasked with overseeing the operation by Nikitin. He planned to assemble the pipeline in advance and then drag it across the riverbed. In this case, the only obstacle for the battalion would be the sandbar at the center of the crossing. This tactic significantly increased the reliability of the pipeline. Despite this, the pipeline would require yet another replacement in July, which was engaged by the 14th Separate Pipeline Battalion. Traditional crossing methods were employed for this operation. 120-meter sections were deployed at the northern bank, and then dragged across the river. Both attempts to apply this method failed. In the first case, the cable snapped, and in the second, the pipeline only made it 700 meters before being rendered inoperable. A new solution was tried to streamline the deployment process, using a pontoon bridge. The pipeline was affixed to the edge of the bridge, which was difficult as personnel had to gradually lower it over the edge, without allowing it to sink into the water. On both sides of the river, tanks were present, one of which served as an anchor, and the other was tasked with towing the pipeline to its respective bank. The towing tank moved at a 30-degree angle to gradually submerge the pipeline, by pulling it away from the bridge. Periodically, this line had to be replaced, but it was by far the most effective methodology. Finally, the need for fuel convoys to cross the river via pontoon bridges was eliminated. Interestingly, before the laying operations had transpired, the Ministry of Oil and Gas Construction, as well as assistance from various technical institutes, conducted studies to verify if Nikitin's proposal was possible. They determined that laying a pipeline across the Amudarya could not be done, and would have enormous financial repercussions if engaged. Despite this, Nikitin moved forward with the operation, and in doing so, demonstrated that field pipelines were indeed the solution the 40th Army required to ease their fuel supply burdens. A similar operation across the Kushka River to access the Kushka-Heret axis would prove simpler. The 2062nd Separate Pipeline Platoon would be formed to service this section. Despite solving the complications associated with delivering fuel from the USSR into the DRA, the 40th Army still relied on motor transport as the primary means to move fuel around the country. 8 separate motor fuel supply battalions were formed for this purpose, which employed Ural 375s. These units could not reasonably keep up with the 750 to 840 tons of fuel consumed each day by combat formations. An analysis of these issues concluded that despite the implementation of improved traffic control systems, it was still impossible to meet logistical goals in such an undeveloped region. Conventional solutions to this problem, notably the creation of more supply battalions, stockpiles, and reserves, were simply not enough. It was concluded after a comprehensive analysis that a daily delivery rate of 1,000 tons of fuel would have required a vehicle fleet with a minimum capacity of 8,000 tons. This was due to the unfavorable road conditions present in Afghanistan, massively extending turnaround times for convoys. Notably, the Haraton-Bagram route took 3 to 4 days to traverse in the summer and 4 to 6 days in winter. Constant ambushes by opposing forces further complicated the situation, especially along the Termez-Kabul highway, alongside traffic disruptions such as snowdrifts, avalanches, and ice, all of which made these estimates increasingly unreliable. The mountainous terrain also increased fuel consumption for these convoys. By the time fuel had arrived, 20% of it had been consumed just to keep the trucks running. For all of the aforementioned reasons, fuel delivery by road was deemed largely ineffective. As a result, the chief of the Fuel Supply Directorate of the Ministry of Defense developed proposals for the application of fueled pipelines to supply the 40th Army. The state of the pipeline troops, at this time, was employed as the primary justification for their involvement, considering that reorganizations to integrate second-generation pipelines and mechanized laying equipment were finalized. There was a wealth of officers, sergeants, and soldiers, who were all highly qualified to be posted in Afghanistan. And 600-kilometer deployments in adverse conditions, including high-altitude arid climates, were institutionally understood. All of this information was presented to Kropotkin and subsequently approved. Kropotkin's decision to allow the pipeline troops to serve in Afghanistan would culminate in the 276th Pipeline Brigade, the 14th Separate Pipeline Battalion, and the 1,461st Separate Pipeline Battalion, being organized and deployed to the region to deploy fueled pipelines along 2 routes, as well as their associated fuel depots, motorized fuel delivery points, and pumping stations. These units were often reorganized based on studies conducted by Nikitin and Bazanov, who often pulled information from daily reports delivered by those serving in subunits. The 25th State Scientific Research Institute of the Ministry of Defense and other organizations provided real-time assistance to the brigade and battalion commanders. In the spring of 1980, the deployment of a PMTP-150 pipeline from the Soviet-Afghan border to Pulakomri was approved. The 14th Separate Pipeline Battalion was reorganized to resemble a diminished form of the 7th Pipeline Brigade serving in the GSFG. To assist the battalion, officers of the 95th Pipeline Brigade were sent to the area. The 14th Separate Pipeline Battalion was 525 personnel strong, including a headquarters, 3 pipeline operation companies, a mechanized assembly company, a motorized transport company, a communications company, a motorized material supply platoon, and a medical unit. The functionality of each of these subunits is outlined in material produced around the time. I will quote from a manual on the matter. The assembly company is intended for mechanized assembly of pipelines with bell and spigot type joints. This is in reference to Rastrub joints. It consists of assembly platoons and a support section. The assembly platoons include assembly squads equipped with pipeline machines. The assembly squad receives the pipes delivered to the route, transfers them from vehicles into the pipeline machine, assembles the pipeline, and hands it over to the pipeline subunits. The quality of the personnel's work in assembly subunits largely determines the timely commissioning of a pipeline, as well as the reliability and stability of fuel pumping. The pipeline company deploys pump stations, receives sections of the pipeline from assembly subunits, ensures its operation, security, defense, patrol and emergency services, and technical maintenance. In addition, it performs tasks of manually assembling pipeline segments in areas where the use of pipeline machines is not possible. Upon completion of the pipeline's operation, the personnel of the pipeline company dismantle the pipeline and pump station tie-ins, load and remove the pipes, pumping equipment and tools from the route, and performs their technical maintenance and warehousing. The pipeline company consists of pipeline platoons and a support section. The company's leadership includes the commander and his deputies, senior technicians. The pipeline platoon includes pipeline squads. The squad is made up of pipe fitters, engine operators, and compressor operators. It has 1 or 2 mobile pump units, a mobile compressor station, pipeline equipment, and assembly tools. The main task of the squad are deployment of the pump station, acceptance of an assembled section of the pipeline, its filling and hydraulic testing, ensuring stable fuel pumping through the section, its security, defense, and patrol and emergency service. During disassembly of the pipeline squad empties the operating section, dismantles the pump station tie-in, removes the pipeline assembly equipment and pump unit, carries out dismantling of the pipeline on its assigned section, loads and removes pipes and equipment, and performs technical maintenance and warehousing. The success of the entire pipeline unit in delivering fuel to the troops depends on the skillful, conscientious, and proactive actions of every pipeline soldier. The motor transport company carries out the transportation of personnel, pipes, pipeline equipment, and other property. It is equipped with pipe transport trucks, cargo vehicles for transporting personnel, line equipment, and utility property, communications company property, as well as tools for towing mobile pump stations. During the pipeline's operation, the vehicles are used to support the patrol and emergency service. The communications company is intended for organizing and maintaining reliable communications that ensure continuous and firm control of the pipeline units, in all types of their activities under any conditions. The company is equipped with radio relay, and wire communication means. During deployment operations and disassembly of the pipeline, the company's personnel, along with the assigned communications equipment, are attached to the pipeline companies and distributed among the platoons and squads. The engineering and technical platoon is intended for performing engineering and technical work during the laying of pipelines across large water obstacles, constructing shelters, equipping command posts, digging trenches to bury pipelines on certain sections of the route, and repairing bridges and roads. It also performs loading and unloading operations when transporting pipes and equipment. The platoon is equipped with vehicles, watercraft, bulldozers, excavators, mobile compressor stations, and automotive cranes. The fuel depot is intended for receiving fuel, ensuring its delivery to the initial pump station, and for delivering fuel at the final point of the pipeline. The fuel depot accounts for the quantity and monitors the quality of pumped fuel. It is equipped with pumping stations, motor pump units, and fuel bladders. Using these means, the depot personnel deploy 1 or 2 intermediate tank groups. By April 23rd, the battalion was prepared for transport to Afghanistan via rail. They prepared for departure in Germany, and after 14 days arrived on May 6 in Uzbekistan. The battalion would march 70 kilometers to the settlement of Amazang on May 7th, where their specialized equipment was awaiting them. From May 8th to May 21st, the equipment was unloaded from trains as it arrived, all of which then needed to be transferred to a temporary storage facility known as TSP-1, while the 254-kilometer deployment route was reconnoitered, and perform calculations alongside document preparation for the pipeline. The conditions in which these actions were conducted were not favorable. Temperatures reached 45 degrees Celsius. The reconnaissance group departed on May 10th. Coordination with motorized rifle and tank units along the route was high, to ensure that none of the commanders from the 95th Pipeline Brigade were at risk of ambush. The epidemiological factors of the route were noted. as well as the availability of clean water. On May 21st, the battalion, excluding one company tasked with unloading more pipeline sets as they were delivered, crossed into Afghanistan. The transport company worked to ensure a steady flow of pipes from TSP-2, located 10 kilometers south of Syed. On May 23rd, an order was issued to begin pipeline deployment at 6 a.m. on May 24th, which lasted until the battalion reached fuel depot number 1386. This pipeline would deliver 2,000 tons of jet fuel, diesel, and gasoline each day. A deployment rate of 46.2 kilometers per day was achieved using 4 TUM-150Vs. The 14th Battalion was allocated armored personnel carriers attached at a rate of 1 per pumping station and company command post. During the pipeline deployment, route markers were often stolen by the local population. So, moving forward to combat this issue, paint was applied directly to the roads alongside the route. The terrain along this route forced much of the deployment to be done next to existing infrastructure, so this was not a significant issue. Due to the proximity of these pipes to the road, incidents occurred where tanks and other heavy vehicles would run over them when taking sharp turns. Patrol and emergency teams were also threatened by the convenience of this route. A common action engaged by opposing forces was puncturing a pipeline before laying an ambush to wait for those units to arrive with the intent to repair the damage. This was usually done to steal the weapons of the arriving emergency teams. The installation of this pipeline lagged behind the previously allocated 5.5 days, due to unfavorable weather conditions, the need to divert personnel towards additional security duties, and the lack of experience among 10% of the unit's personnel who were new recruits. As a rule, work was prohibited past 1600 hours, to allow personnel to rest and gather themselves for fighting at night, which was often necessary. Because of this factor, deployment speed was cut in half, and therefore was more like 23 kilometers per day. The route passed 6 paved roads, 28 dirt roads, passed through a 24-kilometer gorge, and climbed a mountain pass at an altitude of 1,450 meters. Despite this arduous journey, fuel began to flow on the third day. Unfortunately, the expected pumping capacity was not to the previously established calculations, as the pumping stations could not be placed in the optimal position according to hydraulic calculations due to the terrain. Furthermore, pump stations had to be easily protected, and so many of the previously anticipated deployment sites were shifted for closer proximity to guard posts. When equipping garrisons at pumping stations, company command posts, and battalion command posts, the primary focus was protecting personnel and not the equipment at these sites. Initially, only tents were employed, as proper living quarters had not been erected at this time, alongside improvised fighting positions. These were far from adequate. By August of 1980, improvisation within the troops led to decommissioned pipelines being repurposed for roofs, and the wood they were packaged with turned into walls. The pipeline was broken into 3 sections, 77.5, 83, and 93.5 kilometers respectively. Patrolling these sections were BTRs, often BTR-60s. But generally speaking, the pipeline troops relied on motorized rifles to come to their aid in the event of an unexpected engagement. In the summer of 1980, the capacity of fuel depots, intermediate tanks, and the fueled pipeline itself totaled 27,500 cubic meters, which finally met the fuel needs of the 40th Army. This matrix was developed with additional tanks and fuel depots as the war progressed. Opposing forces employed many methods for sabotaging this pipeline, from mining it, shooting it, and sawing it open, to puncturing it with farming equipment. Setting fire to this fuel after a hole was created proved disastrous, as the high pressure inside the pipes allowed for fuel to gush from these wounds and scatter across the terrain, creating large fires. Patrol and emergency teams were often used as ways to gather weapons in the early months of the war, as they often came unprepared for a large ambush. Lessons were learned, and eventually protocols were developed against these sabotage attempts. In case of an attack, fuel is immediately cut off to the affected line. BTRs would arrive and begin suppressing the attackers, after which repair teams would disembark and begin restoring the section. Eventually, the route's security divided the pipeline into sections unique from those serviced by the pipeline troops, which were staffed by companies. Fixed firing positions were erected with relative frequency. Despite all of these actions, in the first few months of the battalion's efforts in the region, 227 attacks were recorded, 70 of which resulted in fires. 870 sections were rendered inoperable in this short period, amounting to losses of 4,588 tons of fuel. This difficult period was necessary to develop the pipeline troops for service in wartime conditions. 9 members of the pipeline troops would lose their lives as a result of the attacks. As time went on, the 40th Army began to consume more fuel, especially diesel fuel, plus an additional 60,000 tons per year, which was delivered to the military and civilian sector of Afghanistan. Despite the difficulties encountered, the 254-kilometer line was highly successful. So successful, in fact, that a second line was to be deployed in December of 1981, to supplement the existing diesel supply, constructed from PMTP-100. This proved difficult, as the battalion was reorganized earlier that year, resulting in a strength of just 384 personnel to maintain both lines. This new line still failed to satisfy the growing appetite of the 40th Army, which was now in dire need of an increased jet fuel supply, especially to Kabul and Bagram, which possessed bases for transport and combat aircraft, both of which consumed an unprecedented amount of fuel due to the frequency of their use. In August of 1982, deployment along the Pulakumri-Bagram route began. The application of the PMTP-100 for this purpose was due to the difficult terrain present on this route, notably the high altitudes, limited roads, numerous precarious bridges, many of which could only withstand foot traffic, and sharp turns. The frequency of rock slides, avalanches, and other natural phenomena also incentivized the use of a smaller, low-profile pipeline that could be more easily repaired. To deploy this line, the 14th Separate Pipeline Battalion was reorganized into the 276th Pipeline Brigade, consisting of nearly 900 personnel. The 276th Brigade introduced 2 additional battalions into the region, significantly expanding the capabilities of the pipeline troops. Officers from various military districts, experienced in commanding such formations, arrived to assist the unit. The individuals who made up this brigade were taken directly from the 40th Army, as they were immediately available. They were not trained in the deployment of pipelines, and therefore had to receive instruction in the field. This hands-on approach to conditioning yielded positive results, as despite their inexperience, the 184-kilometer pipeline was deployed in just 12 days. On August 28th, fuel began to flow along this route to 4 separate fuel depots. Despite its expedient conclusion, this operation was not an easy task. Sections sometimes had to be carried upwards of 3 kilometers into mountainous terrain. In some especially difficult areas, PMTP-100s had to be suspended over gorges or secured to cliffs. The Selang Pass proved to be the most treacherous aspect of this route, due to the extreme altitude. 3 solutions were drafted for overcoming this challenge: bypassing the tunnel and laying the pipeline over the mountains, going through the tunnel inside the ventilation shaft, or through the tunnel along the sidewalk. While laying the pipeline over the mountain was possible, it increased the risk of damage from avalanches and would have significantly diminished access to it for routine servicing. As a result, it was decided to lay the pipeline inside the ventilation shaft above the roadway. The height of this shaft was around 1.7 meters, which made it possible to perform installation with relative ease. This was accomplished in 3 days without complication. This configuration was believed to be unsafe, and so it was later replaced with PMTB-200s along the sidewalk, deployed in 3 lines. These lines were protected from accidental destruction by armored vehicles via a sandbag barrier. During its operation, no failures or issues occurred with this pipeline. It is difficult to discern why exactly the ventilation shaft was evacuated and the PMTB-200s installed. One reason was provided by the book Name-by-Name Reference Book of the Irrecoverable Losses of Soviet Troops in Afghanistan. Here it is posited that the fear of poisoning a large number of Soviet troops passing through the tunnel, mirroring an event that transpired in 1980, when a traffic jam caused fumes to accumulate in the poorly ventilated area, leading to the demise of some service members within the 2nd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade and the 182nd Motor Rifle Regiment, prompted the operation. In 1982, a similar incident transpired involving the 221st Independent Air Force Logistics Battalion, traveling from Kabul to Pulakomri for refueling, consisting of roughly 40 empty tanker trucks alongside a convoy from the 177th Motor Rifle Regiment, the 1074th Artillery Regiment, and the 1003rd Independent Motor Transport Battalion of the 108th Motor Rifle Division. A collision occurred in the middle of the tunnel with an Afghan vehicle, resulting in the rapid asphyxiation of an unknown number of personnel. Those who had not succumbed to the fumes worked to free those around them from their vehicles and drag them to safety. This was likely what pushed the pipes to be removed from the ventilation shaft and relocated externally, to reduce the likelihood of such an event transpiring in the future. The formation of the 276th Pipeline Brigade allowed for the application of field pipelines in Afghanistan to expand significantly. In May of 1984, another PMTP-100 line was deployed to Bagram to supply diesel fuel, and by the end of that year, the Kabul pipeline had been completed. This line possessed a length of 921 kilometers, 876 of which was operated by the 276th Pipeline Brigade, and the other 45 by the 95th Separate Pipeline Platoon. This pipeline was extremely complex, as at multiple points it passed through some of the hardest areas to deploy fuel pipelines, those being mountains, deserts, and civilian dwellings. Constant attacks by opposing forces and arson from the local population made this route impossibly difficult. Due to its proximity to the local population, fuel was frequently stolen with special siphoning devices. The necessity of this route justified the difficulty of the task, as it connected one district fuel depot, the transshipment zone, 2 Army fuel depots, 2 Afghan Army fuel depots, and 1 airfield, totaling 100,000 cubic meters in capacity. An additional 8 intermediate tanks accompanied these assets. These intermediate tanks served the purpose of supplying fuel directly to troops and truck-based fuel transport units, who relied on them to shorten the distance between the formations they were attached to. On the evening of April 4th, 1983, a Kamaz belonging to the 34th pumping station was ambushed. At the scene, units found the assistant chief of the technical section of the 3rd Pipeline Battalion mortally wounded, and the driver missing. A rigorous search to recover the private was launched, which continued through the night, leading them towards a nearby structure. A fierce 10-hour battle was fought here, leading to 5 deaths and 10 wounded among the search party. An obelisk was erected at the site to remember those who perished in the fighting. In 1984, efforts were directed towards reducing fuel losses experienced as a result of attacks and mechanical failures along the Kabul pipeline. The efforts of the pipeline troops were praised by the 40th Army, and this praise included a proposal for the extension of the Bagram-Kabul pipeline by the end of 1985. This ultimately did not transpire, as negotiations to withdraw the limited contingent had already begun. Despite the failure of this concept, a pipeline to Herat was becoming increasingly important. This line was to be relatively similar to the Kabul pipeline, and was to begin at Torgundi. It was here that the 276th Brigade began to stockpile 2 sets of PMTP-150s. In autumn of 1984, the 1,461st Independent Pipeline Battalion, which was 300 strong, was deployed in the Kiev Military District. Its primary units included 3 operational companies. The battalion was reinforced by elements of the 7th Pipeline Brigade of the Belarusian Military District. This unit would be shipped to Torgundi in 2 echelons. This action was completed by November of 1984. After preparatory actions had been engaged, the battalion began to deploy the pipeline on December 14th. 3 temporary storage points for additional pipes had to be prepared along the route to keep the unit supplied as they worked. This 240-kilometer pipeline crossed 4 mountain passes, 3 large settlements, and 28 small towns. 12 kilometers of this pipeline ran through Herat to reduce the risk of arson by the local population. The line was deployed in 10 days. Unfortunately, due to the time of year, water could not be used for testing the pipeline, and so fuel was employed instead. Luckily, no issues arose as a result of this. 22 pumping stations and 3 intermediate tank groups were deployed along this route. Similar to issues encountered on the Kabul pipeline, these pumping stations were not installed in optimal locations due to the fear of enemy incursions, and were instead located near guard posts staffed by motorized rifles. This meant that some of them could not be used, due to unsavory hydraulic characteristics. This line was initially intended to supply jet fuel, but ended up being primarily used for automobile refueling, 25 days per month at a rate of 20,000 tons per day. By early 1985, this line connected the district fuel depot in Kushka, the transshipment base in Torgundi, the army depot in Shinded, and 2 air bases. 555,000 tons of fuel were delivered along this route through the course of its operation. On the evening of November 12, 1985, smoke was detected along the route, and a patrol and emergency team was dispatched, accompanied by a BTR-70. The fire was extinguished without incident, but the moment the group tried to return, they were met with a hail of gunfire from the mountains. The patrol and emergency team responded in kind, and by morning the gunfire had ceased. 1 pipefitter was wounded in the engagement. The 276th Brigade had a rather complex network for pumping fuel through its pipelines. This was due to the volume of pumping stations that had to be managed by the formation. As an example, the Haraton-Bagram pipeline encompassed 48 stations, 8 company control points, and 3 battalion command posts, all of which interacted with 6 fuel depots. To streamline these assets, a dispatch service was present, which included a central dispatch point, 3 battalion-level dispatch points, and 8 company-level dispatch points. By 1987, these pipelines desperately required an increase in pumping productivity. The solution to this issue involved bypassing company dispatch points, allowing the central dispatch point to assume direct control of these pipelines. Every hour, reports on productivity were drafted and dispatched to subunits. The amount of fuel received at storage facilities to the number of armored vehicles present on each route were closely monitored. The central control point kept conventional formations on standby, in case they needed to rapidly respond to an attack along any of the pipelines present within the 40th Army's control. Another solution to improve pumping efficiency was to dedicate additional personnel to the task. Only 10% of the 276th Brigade were tasked with round-the-clock fuel pumping control. With the arrival of 3 additional operational companies in 1986, raising the strength of the formation to 1,038, there was room to redistribute some men to the task. As the conflict continued, the shelling of battalion command posts, company control points, and pumping stations became increasingly problematic. The 34th pumping station was closed in '86 as a result of relentless shelling experience in October. It was common to take pumping stations offline and redistribute their personnel when they became too dangerous. The mining of roadways and pipelines alike made it dangerous to service these routes. The pipeline troops began to adopt dielectric tips for their mine detection tools after an incident on January 31st of 1987, where an electrically fused mine killed the unofficial engineer of the 44th Garrison. The local population, with time, began to engage in more bold actions, such as stealing fuel from pipelines with advanced siphoning methods, the most notable of which involved drilling into the pipeline and extracting fuel before plugging the hole. This made it increasingly difficult to detect damage as theft techniques developed. Stolen joint repair tools also saw use, the application of which was impossible to discern if used correctly. Large-scale theft operations involving multiple trucks with fuel tanks atop them were rare, but were recorded. Repairing sections damaged by enemy combatants near settlements was difficult, as locals sometimes swarmed the site to collect fuel spilled by the rupture, reducing access to the pipeline. Though the local population was not all the pipeline troops had to face. Mudslides, landslides, avalanches, and floods all worked to render sections inoperable. Along the Salang Pass, avalanches were common and often buried multiple kilometers of pipeline in thick layers of ice, deforming and puncturing them. At times, it took more than 4 days to uncover the pipeline and replace the destroyed section. Mudslides in Tashkurgan, Aybak, and Rabtak and through the Salang Pass were common. In 1987, one such occurrence rendered 18 kilometers of pipeline inoperable. This event also blocked pump station PS41 with debris. All of the affected sections had to be replaced. The temperature fluctuations in Afghanistan also worked to accelerate the aging of rubber sealing rings, which led to frequent leaks. In total, 1,650 tons of fuel would be lost to natural disasters. 6 to 7 cases of pipeline damage occurred daily. A quote from an individual who served in the country reads as follows: "The mountains still pleased the eye with sparse vegetation. Higher up, the landscape was increasingly adorned only with bare rocks. In spring, blooming Edelweiss briefly delighted the eyes, and autumn life was brightened by peaceful caravans that occasionally passed through the old Kabul road. Winter here, however, was Siberian in its severity. Sub-zero temperatures persisted from October to May. So much snow would fall that the garrison's residents dug trenches like passages to move along the territory. Patrolling the pipelines in winter here was problematic. One had to rely on the tightness of the joints, but when the snow mass exceeded a critical level, accidents became inevitable. In early February 1986, due to a disconnection between the 38th and 39th GNS, a serious fuel leak occurred. The snow became saturated with fuel. Despite having skis, attempts to find the damaged site proved futile. The soldiers who took part in the emergency campaign only soaked their boots in kerosene. Some even suffered skin burns on their legs from contact with it. Despite these hurdles, in 1986, 652,000 tons of fuel were supplied to the 40th Army, 498,800 of which were supplied by the pipeline troops. Throughout the course of the conflict, fuel, by tonnage, exceeded the mass of all other material products consumed by the limited contingent. This number would steadily decrease as the 40th Army began to withdraw from Afghanistan. To combat these conditions, patrol and emergency teams adapted. As a rule, these units comprised 3 to 4 pipe fitters, a driver, and a team armed with a KPV. BTRs were often turned into repair vehicles, with improvised solutions for carrying up to 10 pipes on the whole becoming common. These units were often stationed at native garrisons, present at pump stations. If the distance between pumps was too large, guard posts manned by motorized rifles would house them. Each day, the schedule in which patrol and emergency teams would embark to make inspections of their assigned section changed according to 5 preset variations. This made it difficult to assess when exactly they would be present, making ambushes less effective. By the spring of 1986, the 276th Brigade was finally armed with its own organic BTR-60s, the operators of which were transferred from motorized rifle formations. On February 20th, 1986, one such BTR-60 was attacked en route to a damaged pipeline section. The vehicle was hit directly by an RPG. The head of the 24th pumping station was seriously injured in this attack, as was the commander of the 2nd Pipeline Platoon. Another incident akin to this attack occurred on April 23rd, 1987, which severely concussed the driver. Despite this, he continued to operate the machine, and push forward to save the lives of those inside. While injured, the crew managed to evacuate the area, and no casualties were reported. The event is remembered as follows. That day was like all the previous ones. We went to have dinner. The duty mechanic came and reported that the pressure had dropped on the first line. We relayed this to the company command post, received permission to head out, and set off. After replacing the pipe, we all got into the APC and headed back to the garrison. After driving about 150 meters, the APC was hit by a grenade launcher. It pierced the armor. The grenade passed close to my shoulder and struck the machine gun. The gun jammed. There's a moment I don't remember. When I came to, the gunner, who had been sitting behind the machine gun, was covered in blood and had fallen onto my knees. A fire broke out inside the APC. When we put it out, the 2nd APC had already pulled in to shield us. We pulled the most seriously wounded out through the front hatches and sent them to the hospital. We sent up a distress signal, a red flare, and kept firing back. When reinforcements had arrived, we headed back to our garrison. On the way, we fixed another malfunction. Measures to reduce fuel losses from attacks were mandatory, as sabotage and shelling increased 5-fold in 1987 compared to what was standard in 1986. Patrol and emergency teams at this time were expanded to 8 people, and an engineer was added to the unit. These units would often dedicate 3 people to repairing a pipeline while another 3 collected fuel, and the other 2 would provide overwatch in preparation for an attack. By 1988, these tactics led to the recovery of up to 1,650 tons of fuel. The largest losses were sustained when the pipeline was set on fire. This also irreparably damaged affected pipeline sections, making repair even more costly. Rubber sealing rings melted. Steel locking rings lost their elasticity. Pipes were deformed, and their protective zinc coating vaporized. The firefighting element of the patrol and emergency teams, for this reason, received special attention in their training and equipment. The Kabul pipeline required 7 motorized rifle and tank battalions to ensure relative comprehensive protection, due to the large concentrations of well-armed opposition forces in the area. On average, each pumping station along this route housed 25 personnel and 1 to 2 armored personnel carriers, and 1 machine gun. Sometimes, pump garrisons in especially hostile localities could exceed 70 personnel. During the day, forward observation posts were occupied by motorized rifles. The distance between outposts was usually 5 to 15 kilometers. Therefore, only about 14% of the entire pipeline could be under constant observation, which unfortunately made sabotage rather easy. On the Toragundi-Shindad route, Mujahideen activity was present only in certain population centers. As a result, only 2 motorized rifle battalions protected this section. 31 personnel and 3 to 4 armored vehicles were common at pumping stations along this route. Each pumping station comprised 2 PNU 100-200M units, an additional unit in reserve, in case one was damaged or rendered inoperable by a malfunction, a living quarters with a dispatching post for patrol and emergency teams, a storage area for spare pipeline sections and equipment, a refueling point for armored vehicles, a firefighting squad with their own dispatch post, a bathhouse, and a shower. Barbed wire was installed around these stations, alongside anti-personnel and signal mines. Command posts, trenches, and bunkers were constructed to shelter personnel from mortars, the entrances of which had firing ports, covered with wire to prevent grenades from being thrown inside. Similar accommodations were present at living quarters, mess halls, and bathhouses. Machine gun emplacements were erected, observing likely avenues of approach that housed NSVs. All open areas were covered with camouflage netting to protect against the sun and sniper fire. Each garrison was equipped with classrooms for training anti-mine practices, general engineering skills that could prove useful in the field, managing pumping stations, and organizing patrol and emergency teams. Many of those who died while supplying fuel to the 40th Army were honored with obelisks, constructed from pipes and other on-hand materials. During the occupation of Afghanistan, these graves dotted routes in which the pipeline troops would patrol. Over the 9 years they were present in Afghanistan, 430 officers, 316 warrant officers, 3,316 sergeants and soldiers served in the 276th Pipeline Brigade. 98 of these sergeants and soldiers, alongside 16 officers, would not return home. Fuel pumping through these pipelines continued until the last days of the Soviet military presence in Afghanistan. The last Soviet soldier in Afghanistan left the country on February 15th, 1989. Pumping would cease just 9 days before this. This was due to the need to create reserves for the Afghan armed forces. According to intergovernmental agreements, the Soviets were to create 3-month reserves of essential materials, including 24.3 thousand tons of aviation, diesel, and automobile fuel. Despite the grueling and unusual conditions they were forced to endure, Afghanistan proved that the pipeline troops were fit to provide an uninterrupted supply of fuel in the event of war, no matter where that conflict may have been.